Thank you very much. And let me see what we have. Commissioner Lomax.
Larry Lomax. As far as military turnout, I just have a question. Is that, when you give that turnout rate, is that based on presidential elections alone, or is that all elections?
That was what I was able to glean from 2008 data, which is the closest I had to any kind of complete data. Yeah, that would be presidential. I would guess in the midterms that number's probably lower.
Yeah, well, I'm a 30-year military guy, and then only reason I brought it up is my experience was the only thing we knew about was kind of congressional level and above.
That's right.
There was very little interest in any local elections.
Well, that's right, and that was my experience in being overseas a lot, was a lot of the local furor about elections is completely lost on them, and so presidential, maybe Congress and Senator, but when you're talking about sheriff and dog catcher, you know, that gets lost in the, you know, paying attention to that stuff, so.
Commissioner Patrick.
Well, I had just a couple of questions regarding Uocava voters. So throughout the presentation, there were a couple of mentions about the success rate being attributed to voter education. Did you in any way think that there might be an impact from the MOVE Act so that the voters have gotten their ballot now at an early point in time? What we've experienced in our jurisdiction is that the voters now have it long enough that they believe that they'll be able to get it back to us in time to be counted, and that has been impactful of the return rate as well.
The MOVE Act was clearly successful. Two things. One, the 45 days, giving more time for the turnaround process. And the second one was the changing of how you treat the FPCA. Instead of 2 election cycles, to back just to 1 election cycle, because if it was 2 election cycles, you just increase the likelihood that the address is bad by a lot, more than double. So that helps. All the election administrators that I talked to were happy about that. That made their life a little easier. The one thing related to this, though, is the local election administrators that I talked to, for the most part, would prefer to be able to treat military Uocava voters that are overseas differently than military voters that are domestic. And this has to do with a time management problem. Because by all estimates, 2/3 of the Uocava ballots that they get are from domestic military. And yeah, they've got a specific issue, and I get that. But the overseas military voter is an entirely different category. And when they get down to this crunch, they would prefer to expend their effort on getting those ballots overseas as opposed to the domestic. They think that in many cases, while they're not willing to recommend that we treat the military voter domestically just like any other absentee, the absentee voting problem for domestically stationed military is closer to the typical absentee problem than the overseas one.
One complication that I would see with doing that would be that many times we'll have them, from what they checked off in the FPCA, as a domestic military voter, but by the time the next elections come around, they in fact have been deployed or they're somewhere else. So there can be some real distinctions and some issues, I think
well, that's
there.
true, and it was already mentioned in one, and I get this constantly from the election administrators. They mail the ballot to a domestic address. Somebody else forwarded it to them overseas. And in many cases, this isn't a case of they got restationed. This was a case of that was just their plan from the beginning, that they were going to mail it to their home of record. Somebody there was going to do it for them to make sure that it got to the right military address.
And then one research question that I had is if anyone knows the number of states that do not allow the federal write-in absentee ballot, the FWAB, as a registration application as well. Or how many do, or
I
how
can
many
get you
don't.
that number. I don't know it off the top of my head. The number, it's available.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just one little point on that, on the FWAB is, part of that's a creature of the federal law, because FWAB was created by the Fed, so it would be nice, but we're not recommending legislation, but that's kind of, you see the deviation, because FWAB wasn't originally intended that way.
I could talk about the part of the confusion on the FWAB, and the local election administrators talk about this all the time. Too many of the particularly young military voters see it as a last-minute emergency ballot. Oops, I messed up, I didn't get to do it, so I'm going to get an FWAB, I'm going to fill it out, I'm going to send it in. I'm not advocating that we count all of those, but to the extent that we can get those somehow enshrined into some kind of process that might be better. a number of those late ballots coming in late are clearly, and from this again, from talking with local election administrators, people who asked for their ballot too late as well. So there's a certain amount of voter malfeasance, if you will, involved in the process of their own. But I don't think that's a major systemic part of the problem.
Charles and Steve, let me ask you a question about a slide in Charles's presentation on page 11, which is the Broward County slide made available by the supervisor on varying wait times within Broward.
Right.
Same administrators doing the planning, same ballot. Why such a huge discrepancy amongst similar sites so close together? Any theories on that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it's too bad that she's gone off to lunch. I'd like to actually talk with her about it. I mean, actually, the first thing I would say is that Dr. Snipes actually mentioned one thing which is oftentimes underappreciated, and that has to do, we can talk about catchments of people living in particular areas, demography, and all those sorts of things. But that, that little circle at 128, I think that's her Miramar library that she talked about, the one with the little room, right? Whereas the ones that have by far the smallest wait times are, as I recall, are supervisor of election facilities. So they own those facilities. They can, they can arrange them how they wish. And so part of it is just the logistics of setting up to vote in a good place. I was playing around myself with this in particular, and it looks to me when I eyeballed it, and I want to get my GIS people on this, that there's a function of where people live, that many of the short waits are in places that have relatively low population densities, and the longer waits are where, kind of the closest place, there's a lot of people there. And you'll recall that Florida constrained where they could do early voting to libraries and to the supervisor of elections places. So basically, the longest wait times are places where there's, that's just the closest library, and there's not a lot of libraries around there, but for whatever reason, there's a lot of people living there. So that would be my main hypothesis looking at this particular data about that variation. Yeah. Steve?
More data. That is my standard answer, isn't it?
You're not by any chance a political scientist, are you?
So, a couple things that I think we've observed over the years about wait times and lines in specific places. One is, if you go back to the other slide on persistence, there are some states that are persistent, and these are places where there are a lot of people. It's very mobile and so forth. There are also states like Florida where you've got a lot of re-precincting going on. And I think re-precincting juggles the lists, creates confusion about where you're supposed to vote and so forth. So one of the cautions here is also where you see a lot of re-precincting, where you see a lot of people getting knocked out of their boundaries for management reasons, for one management reason, it's creating another management problem. And I think one of the things to think about is how do you look across all the management decisions and try to make the management decisions all at once, rather than make this management decision to solve that problem, ignoring the possible other problem that's going to emerge.
Any other questions from commissioners? Tammy?
Sorry, I have just a couple more questions real quickly, and this is for you, Charles. For the early voting period, has your research demonstrated that is there any consistency over the varying times of early voting, which of course some are 30 days, 40 days, 5 days, 8 days. Are there any trends that most jurisdictions see in that the voters all wait till the very end? I've talked to some administrators and they say, no, ours are front loaded. And have you found any that have figured out how to evenly distribute, or at least as evenly distribute them as they can? And also, since we're going to that sweet spot of balancing our resources and the services to the voters, what is, or what has appeared to be nationally, kind of the best early voting period to have where you are servicing the population, but you're not sitting there with all of these expensive sites being open for weeks at a time and the voters aren't coming in, and then there's the crush at the end where you could put some of those resources into the busier time period. What, have you noticed anything there that you could recommend?
At the moment, I haven't. I don't want to say things off the top of my head. I would note, and the best data we have, by the way, about arrival times or time of day with election day voting. So that's to say that early voting is still a bit of a mystery, and it's even more of an administrative challenge because you can't, as you know, you can't control the day in which people are going to show up. I will make the quip that I sometimes say that in political science, what's bad for the country is good for business. And the fact that Florida has actually shortened the time, lengthened the time, shortened the time, lengthened the time, is an opportunity for us actually to test now about how people distribute themselves given different opportunities in the state. The final thing I'll say is that unless you're Ohio, which has an enormously long time, my guess is going to be that with political science will tell us that assuming that something like a week, 2 weeks, you're not going to be able to avoid a rush of people who have already made up their minds and are eager to vote. So you're always going to have a big plug on the first couple of days. And then you're always going to have a plug at the end. And then there's the question that's an empirical question about modeling those two within the middle. Luckily, it looks like the number of people who want to vote early is relatively stable from time to time. And so, I mean, this is amenable to study, but we just don't know the answer to that yet.
Thank you.
Actually, that has been studied. I'm trying to remember who did it, and it was exploiting the variation at times. Turns out that 14 days versus 7 days, same number of people voted, bump at the beginning, bump at the middle, and nothing, very little in between. So you do get the early, late. So that seems to be a behavioral phenomenon. Part of it goes back to the campaigns. So if you have really active GOTV and they're targeting early voters, they push those guys to vote early to get them off the list so they don't have to keep going back and calling them, and they save money. So it's also a function of the political organizations.
And that would make sense. We have some experiences where we have a challenge with our media where they don't want to talk about the election until a couple of days before the election, and that's the first that unfortunately many voters are hearing about early voting and that sort of thing. So I think voter education is critical. So thank you.
Commissioner Echeverria?
Charles, excellent work. So thank you for that. Just a quick question. I was struck by your observations and your persistency data that you did the comparison, your conclusions, California versus Florida, similar demographics, et cetera, but yet they have dramatically different wait times. And
Right.
Part of our task is definitely undue delay. So is it possible for you to take the metrics or the prescriptions data for California versus Florida? Is that a simple undertaking, a complex undertaking, and then just looking at the two, draw any conclusions in terms of undue delay?
I've not done that, and so I can't give you the answer to that. When I've talked to my colleagues who are operations researchers and who've made a living answering questions like this, they tell me that's a trivial question, that it's not a hard question. I mean, it might require resources and persistence and doing it right, but it's a known art, and it could be done.
So it could be done.
It could be done, yeah.
Thank you.
Joe, I think the interesting study to do here is to take LA County and Miami-Dade, both of which are large enough that we actually have some survey data penetration, so there's enough data in each.
Right.
And to get the data from those two commissioners, from Dean out in LA and from the Miami-Dade Commission, and get everything we can get about their length of lines, list quality, and so forth, down at the precinct level, and try to develop a good picture. It's interesting that under the previous commissioner in LA, they abandoned early voting because nobody was using it. So they used an extensive amount of absentee balloting, so it's going to be a different story regarding Charles's absentee ballot story. In fact, they create permanent absentee precincts to kind of manage some of these things. So they're actually pushing people into the mail ballot system. And so there might be some completely different ways of dealing with these problems. We do know also that something else Charles pointed out, which is the lines are longer in early voting than they are in the precincts on average around the country. So early vote, the spread of early voting, which was quite rare around 2000 and ballooned over the last decade, is feeding into the lines because people go to voterly, and they get stuck in a line.
So LA County is, got on average, is closer to 7 minutes, would that be fair?
Actually, LA County might even be a little below California, so it's
Okay,
around.
so it's
Yeah.
got the short data.
It's a short county. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Outstanding panel. We much appreciate it. Obviously, we hope you'll be available to provide further information to the commission as we continue in our discussions.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.